Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, wherever you are. We appreciate you taking some time with us today to talk about a very important topic as it pertains to uncashed checks. For today's agenda, we're going to cover a few things. In a second, introduce myself as well as my coworker here at PBI. We'll get into the DOL guidelines and how they pertain to uncashed checks, what folks are doing to address those guidelines, challenges that we've heard. We've been mitigating checks for 12 years now as a company, have lots of experience working with both participants, plan sponsors, obviously providers, in not only figuring out where participants are, check owners are, but getting them to act, getting them to do what you want them to do. A participant advocate approach is certainly one in which we're trying to get the folks to do what we want, request a reissued check and cash it, right? Get them to take control of any outstanding assets that they might have. When we're talking about the new DOL guidelines, which we'll touch on in a second, I think it really puts into a framework the challenges that plan sponsors have felt for many years now as it pertains to uncashed checks. What we see is oftentimes nothing might be done. Maybe it's an easy project to kick down the road a little bit because you're not sure what you're really supposed to do. The guidance that's been out there has been slim, if none, when it pertains to uncashed checks. So that obviously leaves lots of question marks and a project that can probably be put off. With what's been happening over the last 6 years or so with Department of Labor investigations, it's critical to put together procedures, follow those procedures, and really work towards getting a participant or an uncashed check owner their asset back, get them in control. But really, at the end of that process, you're not continuing to have a growing problem of uncashed checks that might be 2, 3, 5, 10 years old. It's to put together a best practice due diligence effort. At the end of that process, if that check owner does not come forward, you have discussed, have a procedure on parking those assets in an area that's comfortable for you as the fiduciary. And we'll touch on some of that as well. So definitely wanted to thank you all for listening in today. We have some questions that we've received in advance of the presentation that we've incorporated some of them into the presentation. And at the end there, you see the Q&A. We're going to take live questions from you, so please fire away during this webinar, and we'll get to those that we can towards the end. At the end of the presentation, we ask that you stay on where we have a poll question that we'd like to ask as well. So please, if you could take the time to do that and answer that question, that would be great. So moving to the next slide. My name is Mark Sweatman. I'm a new business development manager here at PBI. I've been in the industry for 19 years, helping plan sponsors, providers, mitigate a variety of different participant risks, whether it's missing participants, uncashed checks, locating beneficiaries, death audits, a lot of the participant risks that we as fiduciaries, as plan sponsors, look to figure out what's the best way in which we can get these folks uncovered and get them to do what you want them to do to help protect yourselves as fiduciaries. I'd like to turn it over to Greg to introduce himself as well now.
Thanks, Mark. My name's Greg Cunningham. I'm also a new business development manager here at PBI. I have my background as I have over 20 years in the financial service industry, as well as the last 9 working with the death audits, the missing participants, and today's special topic, uncashed checks. I'd like to move on and first start with the suite of products that we use that surround uncashed checks. As you see, uncashed checks at the bottom there. We start at top left. We have the best death audit product in the industry. We have almost 27,000 sources where we're finding deaths, but it's important when we're doing an uncashed check project to know if someone's dead or alive. We also do data cleanse, if you see right below that, where if you have bad data, whether you're missing a social security number or a date of birth or an address, we can help you fill that in. And that ties back to the top right, our locate service, which is where we help you work through all the missing addresses that you may have, or confirming the current address you have. And then at the bottom, you see bottom right, beneficiary research. In this project, if we're doing an uncashed check project, we're going to find deceased people. Some of them checks maybe 10 years or older. And we're going to find that the plan does not have any beneficiary on file. We can help fix that for you. So we're going to take these processes when we set up uncashed checks, an uncashed check process for clients. We take these different processes that we have and make sure we're delivering the best product for you and your client if you're a provider.
So what's changed? I think there's been a lot of gray out there in the marketplace as to what you do when it comes to missing participants or uncashed checks. There's been some guidance out there, whether it's an older field assistance bulletin that primarily talks about terminating defined contribution plans and what you do with missing or non-responsive participants there. But there hasn't been anything that's really been concrete on what the department might be thinking as far as how best to address these types of topics. So in January of this year, they released a new best practices guidance for missing participants. There is still some gray, decent amount of gray in it as to how you can interpret some of the things they're stating. However, the one thing that is clear and is at least brought into focus, whether it pertains to you or not as a plan sponsor, is that it applies to active plans on both the DB and DC side. So here we are, anybody active, it applies. So that at least has gained some clarity for plan sponsors out there on whether this new guidance even applies to you or not. That further, when you see missing participants, how does that really pertain to uncashed checks? Does it pertain to uncashed checks? And they're clear in the way they say that EBS has learned from its experience in their investigations over the last 6 years of plan sponsors that the following red flags are often warnings or indicators of a problem with missing or non-responsive participants. And one of those is absence of sound policies and procedures for handling uncashed checks. So in the past, or when you think of a guideline like this and it pertains to missing participants as well as checks, is a missing participant, is a stale check owner, checks that were cut that were returned undeliverable, so therefore it's a missing check owner, or is it also stale that are 6 months old, as an example, and the participant never cashed the check or the check owner never cashed the check. I think when they're referring to non-responsive participants as well, it can be inferred that it's both. So you're talking about not only missing participants, you're talking about undeliverable checks that are sent, as well as non-responsive checks, therefore stale dated because 6 months, as an example, has gone by. So what we're going to also talk about today is how you can address them, as well as how do we reduce the problem, the growing issue of these stale checks. What options do we normally see with plan sponsors and providers today? So one of the things I'd like to talk about, and Greg, maybe I'll throw it over to you. The new DOL guidelines obviously pertains to checks, as I just mentioned, but maybe we can talk about a pitfall that we certainly see when it comes to stale checks.
So, some of the pitfalls, they differentiate between the defined benefit and the defined contribution plan. On the defined benefit and defined contribution, or defined benefit and cash balance side of the plan, you now need to treat those stale checks as missing participants. Um, the on that side of the house, there's an end destination that would be the plan or the trust. On the defined contribution side, that is a participant-owned account. So the fiduciary needs to do a little bit more to reunite not only the participant or spouse, as it would be in an awful lot of defined benefit plans. If there's no spouse, you have to look for other beneficiaries of that participants. So that's a big part of the difference between the two style of plans. And then some of the things that why checks go uncashed. There's the checks that get through. There's the known missing. They're the ones that come back as undelivered, and then the unknown, the ones that get through, whether it's a separation or a divorce. I have a friend of mine that I talk to about what I do with uncashed checks, and he reminds me all the time that, hey, I just got another letter for the O'Briens. So there's several reasons why we're getting uncashed checks, but what this guidance, we believe, it does is says you cannot stick your head in the sand any longer. If you're not addressing this problem, there could be serious problems if you ever get audited.
Right. And I think some of the challenges, like you say, is, I have a lineage of postal employees in my family, and we can't make the assumption that they bat 1,000, right? So I'm sure you've got a piece of mail from someone you don't know delivered to you inadvertently, and they might live 3 streets over or in a totally different town, but that gets through, right? Like Greg was touching on, there are scenarios where a check goes out, the ones that get returned undeliverable. What we don't know is those that get stale. Did it really get to the participant, to that check owner, or do they not live there? And that happens. So a check gets through, like Greg touched on. Perhaps there's a separation or a divorce going on in that household. So the post office delivers that mail, the surname matches, but that participant doesn't live there. They haven't lived there for a few years. It's going to their ex-spouse, as an example. Another thing, like Greg touched on, is new owners that get the previous person's mail and just throw it in the trash. So nothing is telling the post office that there's a problem there, so it gets delivered. But these can be really challenging because it's a scenario where it's stale. Did the check owner fail to cash it? Did they fail to cash it because it was only worth 20 cents, so it's not worth their time and effort to make the effort to cash it? Or is it a scenario where the mail just got through, but that owner is not there and hasn't been there for quite a while? The other thing that I think we can all understand is nursing homes. As folks age, perhaps they go into a nursing home. This happened to me with my mother recently, where I moved her into a nursing home and changed her address to mine. If I don't know what she was invested in, what she, perhaps a pension plan or a 401k plan, and that comes across, and maybe she worked for a retailer, and that to me looks like marketing material, I might just throw it right in the trash, where in reality it's important information or a check that she needs to actually cash. So there are a variety of different ways in which checks go uncashed. If we can go to the next slide. The new DOL guidelines for best practices, where we're applying this to uncashed checks as well, has 10 best practices that they've laid out. This is a really busy slide, and I apologize for that. It's hard to get all this into a slide that's easily readable. But I think the point we're trying to make here is the day of doing a search and a mailing are over. It's important. In prior webinars we've held this year with outside counsel from different law firms pertaining to missing participants with these new guidelines, the feedback is plan sponsors should meet, talk about each one of these 10 steps, and determine which ones they want to do and which ones they don't, and why. It's imperative to have a documented procedure, the frequency by which you're going to address your uncashed checks or your missing participants, and make sure that you're following that. And oftentimes that's going to take you with, close consultation with your providers to make sure that that's happening. One thing in the investigations over the last 6 years is the Department of Labor was not expecting to find what they found. They obviously frown upon anybody that's 70 or 75, as an example, is never taken to distribution. But when they back into that, they're trying to find out what is the plan sponsor doing to avoid that from happening. So a couple of these, and this is just my personal view, it's not PBI's, but one of the things that is very new and I have not seen in my past history coming from the department is reaching out to former colleagues of the missing participant or check owner in this case, right, to see where that participant may live. I would look at that potentially as a privacy issue. However, that's for each plan sponsor to take a look at and determine, does this step make sense for us to do? Yes or no? And if no, why aren't we going to do it? Document that as a procedure on how you're addressing your uncashed checks and make sure it's being followed. So if that's an annual process you're looking to do to address your uncashed checks, make sure you're doing that. Absent a policy and a procedure, when the department comes in, and we've heard from clients that have had these investigations, is if there is a procedure in place and it's not being followed, that's almost just as bad, right? Because you can say you're going to do all these things. If you're not doing them, that's a problem. These types of issues, as I had touched on earlier, are we all get lost in our everyday world, and it's easy. The annual funding notices are coming back. They're back. You have all your undeliverable mail. Why wait until November or December to get those cleaned up because you have other priorities going on? So it's critical to tackle these things as they occur. If we go to the next slide. So some of the challenges, right? So Greg, you've seen this. People that are unwilling to cash the check. What happens there for a plan sponsor or a provider from your perspective?
Well, I mean, they have to be treated the same as someone who does not get the check. The provider or the plan sponsor has a bad address, and you could live right next to the person and know they're right there, but they're just unwilling to cash it for whatever reason it might be. A tax issue, a perceived tax issue. It's not enough money for them to go to the bank and cash it, but they need. It looks to us with the guidance that they need to be part of the stale check and be treated the same as someone that comes back as undelivered from the post office. So we need to do the due diligence with them the same way we would do with a RPO from the post office.
Right. And so some of the things we see after we put together a check mitigation process, as an example, in consulting with the plan sponsors or the provider, is what do we do? The goal here, right, is to not have a growing population of stale checks. The goal is to get a procedure in place. If the participant does not come forward requesting a reissued check during that process, where are any remaining assets going to go at the end of that process? So let's make the assumption your checks go stale at 6 months. You want to address your uncashed check population annually. Theoretically, the oldest check you should have would be 1.5 years old. So it goes through a mitigation process. And oftentimes the areas where we see any remaining assets being moved by plan sponsors or providers at the end of the process is, one is a rollover. Rollovers, things to think about when you're considering rolling any remaining assets over after a mitigation process, would be were taxes withheld for this individual, right? So if they were, do you want to have a conversation with the rollover provider about an after-tax IRA? If taxes obviously weren't withheld, go to a regular IRA. What are the fees that rollover provider is going to charge? Is there a setup fee, an annual fee? What does that model look like? And really the most important part, and where the question around the fees comes into play, is what's going to be done to get the check owner to know that they have that account once it's rolled over, right? So assume you put together a mitigation process, you select rollover. How often are they trying to figure out the best address? How often are they trying to communicate with that participant? So it doesn't become a scenario where this person's just having, money deducted from their asset year over year because no effort's being made to try to connect them with this asset. Secondly, we see, and this is in no particular order, by the way, we see plan sponsors selecting back to the plan's forfeiture account. I think of this often as a way in which, if you will, an uncashed check or an unclaimed fund, if you will, where, is it okay to park it there? You put together a mitigation effort, you move any remaining assets into the plan's forfeiture account. Should they be looked at? And this is actually brought out in the new guidance as well. How often should they get an opportunity to come forward? Do you just sit there in perpetuity? Does it, every 3 years you look at those accounts and still try to make an effort to get those forfeited dollars back to the rightful owners? So things to think about there, right? And really questions for you with inside or internal or external counsel would be, what happens if the owner goes, over the ERISA protection, whether that's 70.5, 72? Let's say, you have somebody in forfeiture from 10 years ago that when you moved into forfeiture, they were 70. Now they're 80 years old. Is that a conversation that says, is this still considered ERISA, right? Is this something that perhaps should be looked at as let's try to get these participants their money, and then perhaps it gets cheated because it's outside of that ERISA window. And then we also see accounts where they're moving it back and reopening the participant record. I think from a plan sponsor's perspective, we're potentially a little hesitant of that because it's a problem. Maybe all they have left is this cash, and we're now reopening probably a low balance check, which when you're looking for providers, that may not be the most attractive offering for you with a record keeper, as an example, where now you have a lot of low balance accounts with a lot of accounts in general, right? So normally the higher average asset value with the least amount of accounts is the most attractive for a provider. So those are the scenarios we typically see. Greg, what if a plan sponsor or a provider can't locate a beneficiary in this scenario?
Well, that does come up, that we find deceased and there's not a beneficiary and they're not easy to find. So we have processes that we can help you find a beneficiary. But if we cannot find a beneficiary, that's where the plan needs to be prepared for that. Does that just go into forfeitures at that point, or reopen the account? Rollovers, not all rollover providers will take deceased accounts. So these are things that need to be addressed when we start the plan with the uncashed check process. So if it's just a missing beneficiary, we can help find them if they're available, but not everyone is. So what happens then? So again, part of your the due diligence process and being prepared for that.
Right. And a question that was asked in advance is, what about a sheet? And I think, we don't see a sheet as often as we did maybe 5-10 years ago. And I think a lot of that is a real healthy conversation between the provider and the plan sponsor to understand how the plan sponsor fiduciary views these uncashed checks. I think, we used to see perhaps a provider who interprets an uncashed check differently than a plan sponsor, not maliciously, nothing like that, but more so because in theory, a participant requested a check, taxes were withheld, Now that amount is sitting in a DDA account until it gets cashed by the participant, and they fail to cash it. So now the thought process is, well, taxes were withheld, so it's no longer a plan asset. I think in good faith, when we talk to plan sponsors, they would have a different interpretation, say, well, I know that that cash is coming from the 401k plan, so we may view that as a plan asset, even though taxes were withheld. So that oftentimes causes a little bit of confusion, and certainly worth having that conversation if you're a plan sponsor with your provider on what their thoughts are versus perhaps the way in which you're envisioning these uncashed checks. The other thing about escheat is there can be unintended consequences with that, right? So if perhaps your company is not necessarily up to snuff when it comes to escheating property that's escheatable, right? There's like 120 different property types, vendor checks, all kinds of different property types. If this is now property that gets turned over as escheated, and it's a state that hasn't seen this property as escheated from your company in the past, it can create a red flag and actually wind up getting you audited across the board as a company, which can be a bigger problem when it comes to state unclaimed property audits. So just something to think about. You think you're doing the right thing, you're turning it over, you're escheating it. If they haven't seen that property, it can cause a red flag. If we go to the next slide, wanted to give a couple of examples. This is, a client that works with us, a mid-sized record keeper. They send out 16,000 checks a year that get returned undeliverable. So missing, right? It gets bounced back. Work to mitigate those. 7,200 go stale on average every year. So mailed out, person never cashed it. Is it because the value of the check? Is it because the participant misplaced it? We don't know, and we're making lots of assumptions. So therein lies why a mitigation step to get that participant another shot to request their reissued check can be made, and then if they don't come forward, move those to those end destinations. In this case, our client, we've saved them close to $250,000 a year, excluding any old hard costs of remailing or reissuing checks that they had. If we go to the next slide, this is an example of a large retailer we work with. It's critical. You see there top left, check type. The importance of check type comes into play. This is a loan overpayment. Most plan sponsors, I would expect, would not consider that ERISA. That falls outside of ERISA and probably something that should be escheated. Loan overpayments, excess contributions, those types of scenarios that happen. If you follow below that, there's 3 where no 1099-R was issued. That would be an example. If you're selecting rollover, does that go into a regular IRA? Versus the last 3 there on the left-hand side where taxes were withheld, do you have that conversation with the rollover provider about moving them into an after-tax IRA? So that's a final example. We go to the next slide, and I apologize, we're running out of time here. I did want to allow time for that last polling question. We appreciate your time today. If we go back, can we go back one? Maybe not. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact Greg or I. We're happy to answer any questions to your particular needs that you may have. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, everyone.